The ledger lies open on the desk, candlelight catching the edge of its spine. We are in a merchant's study in the Dutch Golden Age, sometime in the winter of 1636. Outside, the wind moves through Haarlem and Amsterdam and Alkmaar, towns built on water and commerce, where tulips rest in dark soil and men gather in candlelit rooms to trade promises about flowers they cannot see. The rooms around us are filling with a particular kind of fever, not the fever of war or plague, but something quieter and more insidious. Something that moves in ledgers and on slate boards, in wine glasses and in whispered conversations that travel from tavern to tavern, city to city, merchant to merchant. Men are trading pieces of paper for flowers, not real flowers that they can hold in their hands or see bloom in a garden. Promises of flowers, bulbs sleeping 3 feet down in dark earth, waiting for the spring thaw, while the price of the invisible bloom climbs higher than anyone imagined possible. One man in particular sits at the center of this story. His name is Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel. He is not famous. History does not sing his praises. No paintings were made of him, no poetry was written in his honor. His own words have not survived. He speaks to us only through the aftermath of his death, through the records of what was left behind, through the great auction that will disperse his collection and cascade through the market like a stone dropped into still water. But in the hands of those who inherit what he leaves behind, his orphaned children, whom he will never see grow to adulthood, passes the single largest documented flower sale of the entire mania. 99 lots of tulip bulbs, some individual prized specimens, some collections of varieties, each lot described and examined and offered to the highest bidder. Nearly 90,000 guilders, more money than 100 skilled craftsmen could earn in their lifetimes, all converted into the promise of flowers, all hanging on the belief that the price of beauty will only ever rise. The sum that will drive our story forward and then backward into loss. The fever that builds, peaks, and then collapses into recrimination and ruin, and the quiet aftermath of disillusionment. Before we begin, if you'd like the ledger opened again next week, the subscribe button is just below. Best to press it now while the lamp is still lit. Dim the lamp, I'll keep the ledger. The story does not begin in Holland. It begins in Constantinople, in the Ottoman court, where a diplomat named Ogier de Busbecq walks through gardens in the middle of the 16th century. He is watching the flowers, tulips the Turks call them, from the word for turban, because of the cup of their petals. They bloom in the spring meadows outside the city in colours that seem to have no name in Latin or Flemish. Reds so deep they verge on black. Yellows that catch light like polished brass. Stripes and flames and variegations that no European gardener has ever seen. Busbecq writes about them in his letters home. He collects seeds. He collects bulbs. And when he leaves Constantinople in 1562, after 8 years as the Holy Roman Emperor's ambassador to the Sultan, he carries with him the first tulip bulbs ever brought to Western Europe, carried like treasure, like contraband, like seeds of an empire he is bringing home in miniature. These bulbs begin to travel. From Constantinople to Vienna, from Vienna along the trade routes of the Low Countries, north toward Antwerp and Amsterdam. Somewhere in this journey, they reach the hands of a man named Carolus Clusius, a botanist and scholar who has accepted a post at Leiden University in the province of Holland. It is 1593. Clusius is in his 80s, and he has been given a small plot of land, a hortus botanicus, a botanical garden, where he can plant his collection. In the spring of 1594, the tulips bloom in Leiden for the first time north of the Alps, and Clusius sees something that will shape the entire history of this flower. Some of the blooms are broken, not broken in their structure, but broken in their appearance. Where a solid red tulip should emerge, there comes instead a white petal streaked with red, a yellow flower with purple flames, a pink bloom with white edges, as if painted by an uncertain hand. These broken tulips are weak. Clusius can see it. They are smaller, more fragile. They seem to live shorter lives. They will likely die. But they are also the most beautiful things he has ever seen. Clusius does not understand what is happening. He will never understand it. It will take science 3 more centuries to discover that the breaking is caused by a virus, tulip breaking virus. A microscopic thing passed through the soil and through the touch of hands and tools. It weakens the bulb and will eventually kill it. But in the moment of its viral corruption, before the death comes, the bulb produces a flower unlike anything nature has made before. It is as if the flower knows it is dying and paints itself one final time in colors of desperation and defiance. And this is the flower that Holland will desire above all others. Clusius begins to sell tulips from his garden. Not for much. They are novelties, expensive by the standards of the time, but not yet the objects of obsession. He sends them to other botanists, to wealthy collectors, to the merchants and nobles who can afford such things. The tulips travel again, from Leiden to Amsterdam, to Haarlem, to Alkmaar, to Utrecht. Wherever Dutch merchants gather and trade, the tulips begin to appear. In the gardens of wealthy men, in pots on windowsills, as objects to be owned and displayed and spoken of in low, reverent tones. A bulb that produces an ordinary red tulip might be worth a few stuvers, the loose change of the merchant class. A broken tulip, a truly beautiful one with the sought-after patterns and colors, begins to command different prices. 1 guilder, 2, 5. By the turn of the century, a single bulb of a particularly beautiful broken tulip, a variety called Semper Augustus, with its white flames on a background of deep crimson, is worth as much as a good house in Amsterdam. Not the house itself, you understand, only the bulb. Only the promise of a flower that will bloom once, and then, perhaps, never bloom exactly the same way again. And this, too, is something that Clusius, old, dying, his work nearly complete, has given to Holland. The knowledge that the rarest, the most broken, the most fragile flowers are the ones worth pursuing to the point of ruin. He dies in 1609. By then the trade is well established. By then the merchants of Holland have already begun to see the tulip not as a flower, but as an investment. Not as something to grow and admire in a garden, but as something to buy and sell and trade, hand to hand, in ledgers and promissory notes, in futures contracts written on pieces of paper and sealed with wine and the honor of a man's word. The garden he built remains in Leiden. The tulips continue to bloom, to break, to produce their unpredictable variations. But Clusius's careful study, his scientific curiosity, his love of the flower for its own sake, these things have already been replaced by something else, something darker, something hungrier, something that will, within another generation, consume a man named Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel and transform his orphaned children into the richest figures in the history of flowers. To understand what Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel inherited, to understand what drove him and the men like him into the fever of the mania, you must first understand the nature of the tulip's beauty. It is not a straightforward thing. It is not simply that some tulips are lovely and others plain. Rather, it is that the broken tulip exists at the edge of life and death, at the boundary between perfection and collapse. And this boundary is what makes it precious. Here is what happens when a tulip-breaking virus infects a bulb. The virus spreads through the cellular structure slowly, quietly, invisibly. The infected bulb can still grow, it can still send up leaves and a stem, it can still produce a flower. But as the flower emerges, as the petals unfold, the virus disrupts the pigmentation. The solid color breaks into patterns, flames appear, stripes emerge as if painted by an invisible hand. The bulb is weakened. It will eventually die, yes, sometimes within a year or two. But first, for this one brief moment, this one flowering, it produces something unprecedented. A broken tulip has never flowered before. It will never flower in exactly this pattern again. Each year, if it survives, it blooms differently. The virus shifts, the pigmentation changes. A white tulip with red flames might emerge the next season as a deep crimson with white striations, or it might break again into new patterns altogether, or it might revert to a solid color, its moment of beauty already past. This is why they were worth so much, not because they were robust or reliable, precisely because they were fragile, precisely because they would die, because they represented a moment of rarity so extreme that it could never be duplicated or guaranteed. And precisely because of this, they could not be reliably sold. Here is the practical problem that the merchants of Holland faced. In the springtime, a man might walk into a garden and purchase a bulb. The bulb will bloom. He will see the flower. He will decide whether to buy another bulb of the same variety. But a tulip bulb can only be safely uprooted and moved in the summer, when the bulb has gone dormant in the earth. In the winter, when the merchant class has the most time and inclination to sit in taverns and conduct business, the bulbs are buried. They are sleeping. They cannot be shown. They cannot be seen. So the Dutch traders invented a solution: windhandel, wind trade, trading in air. Buying and selling bulbs that they could not touch, could not see, promises written in ink on paper or scratched onto slates and passed hand to hand by candlelight, sealed with wine. A man might own a particularly beautiful broken tulip in his garden. When the bulb goes into the ground at the end of summer, he knows roughly how many offset bulbs, smaller bulbs growing from the mother bulb, it will produce come next summer. He might sell the promise of these offsets before they even exist. He might sell them to a dealer. The dealer might sell them to a merchant. The merchant might sell them to a collector, or to another merchant, or to a wealthy amateur who simply wants to have them, to own them, to speak of them at dinner parties. Each transaction involves a fee. Each transaction involves wine. Each transaction strengthens the belief that the bulb will be worth more next time, that the next purchase will be a better investment than the last. By the 1630s, the trade in windhandel has expanded to include a vast number of tulip varieties. There are the rosen, the rose-coloured tulips. There are the violetten, the purples with deeper tones. There are the bizarres, named for their bizarrely complex patterns, white ground with red and yellow striping, or yellow ground with red and white flames, patterns so intricate that they seem to have been painted by someone in a delirium. And there are the Rembrandt tulips, named by later historians for the painter who was alive during the mania. They were not called this at the time, but they are the ones that most resembled his paintings, dark reds and purples with gold or white striations, colours so deep they seem to have shadows in them, as if the tulip is not simply red, but is red the way a room is dark when there is only one candle burning in the corner. A Rembrandt tulip might sell for a few hundred guilders in the summer market, when the bulb could be shown, when it could be touched, when its lineage could be verified. But in the winter market, in the taverns, in the wind trade, the price could climb. A few hundred, then 1,000. Then, for the rarest and most beautiful specimens, prices approached what a man might pay for a substantial house. There was no logic to it. That is the thing to understand. There was no underlying reason why a tulip should be worth more than a canal-side mansion. But there was a reason, if you looked closely. The reason was that someone had bought one yesterday for more money than the day before. And if someone had paid that much yesterday, then surely someone would pay more tomorrow. The only logic was this. The price was rising, therefore it would continue to rise, therefore it was rational to buy. This is the fever. This is what Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel inherited. Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel is not known to us from his own words. He left no diary. He wrote no letters that have survived. He speaks to us only through the records of his death and through the great auction that followed it. But we can assemble a portrait from the world around him, from the structure of the trade that he participated in, from the kinds of transactions that men like him conducted. He was, to begin with, not a gentleman. He was not born to nobility or wealth. He was a dealer, a trader, an innkeeper. This is important. The Tulip Mania, in its final fever, was not an obsession of the noble classes or the artistic elite. It was an obsession of the merchants, the traders, the middlemen, men who had made money and now sought to make more. Men who understood commerce but not gardening, who understood profit but not botany, who understood the mechanics of a rising price but not the nature of a flower. Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel kept an inn. In Holland in the 1630s, an inn was not merely a place where travellers slept. It was a social hub, a trading post, a place where merchants gathered to conduct business. And if you kept an inn, you were in an ideal position to hear of transactions, to put buyers in touch with sellers, to facilitate the exchange of information and money. Somewhere in the network of his business, Wouter acquired tulips. He may have begun as a hobbyist, a man who thought the flowers were beautiful and wanted to grow them. Many men started that way. Many men bought a bulb or two and planted them in their gardens, and then became fascinated by the breaking, by the new varieties that emerged, by the possibility that their ordinary bulb might produce an extraordinary flower next spring. But at some point, perhaps gradually and then suddenly, the hobby became a business. Wouter accumulated bulbs. He became known as a man who had access to good varieties. He became, in other words, a dealer. And in Haarlem, the city where Wouter likely conducted most of his business, the dealing took a particular form. It centered on the taverns, specifically on the trade colleges, A college, or collegie in the Dutch of the time, was not an academic institution. It was a social club, a trading circle, a group of men who met regularly to conduct business and to socialize. The colleges had names, they had meeting places, they had rituals and rules. Some were quite formal, some were casual gatherings that happened whenever the men found themselves in the same tavern on the same evening. In Haarlem, the main colleges met in the tap rooms and back rooms of the taverns. The most famous was the college that met in the Prinsenberg Tavern, though there were others scattered throughout the city. In these rooms, candles burned low over tables where slates lay ready, where wine was poured, where the air grew thick with conversation and speculation. The mechanics of a college trade were elaborate and precise, a kind of ritual that transformed the act of buying and selling into something more like a game or a ceremony. Here is how it worked. A man would arrive at the tavern with news of a bulb he wanted to sell. Perhaps it was a rare variety. Perhaps the bulb had produced an unusual flower the previous spring, or perhaps it came from a famous lineage, a bulb that had been bred and selected over many years. The man would describe the bulb, and this is crucial. He would not bring the bulb itself. He might describe it in great detail, but the bulb remained in the ground somewhere, perhaps in his own garden, perhaps in the garden of a grower, perhaps still in the ground of the merchant who currently owned it. The interested buyer would then be given a slate, a wooden board with a dark surface that could be written on with chalk or a piece of soft stone. The buyer would write down the price he was willing to pay on this slate. The seller would write down the price he was asking. The two slates would be passed to a pair of arbitrators, designated traders who had earned the trust and respect of the colleges through years of participation. These arbitrators would take the two slates, examine the two prices, and determine a price somewhere between them. This was the agreed price. This was the transaction. When the deal was concluded, when the arbitrators had settled the price, there was wine. The buyer or the seller, depending on the custom of the college and the nature of the transaction, would purchase a bottle of wine, which would be opened and shared among everyone present. The wine had a specific function. It was part of the transaction cost, a small fee that went into the social fabric of the college, that confirmed the binding nature of the deal. This was windhandel. This was the mechanism by which thousands of transactions took place, by which bulbs worth hundreds of guilders changed hands in the winter, when the bulbs themselves were invisible, buried in the dark. Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel would have been a regular in these rooms. He would have known the arbitrators. He would have known the rituals. He would have had slates written with his offers, slates that settled on prices both reasonable and outrageous, depending on the mood of the market, the reputation of the bulb, and the fever that was building year by year in the winter of 1636. And the fever was building. In the merchant classes of Haarlem, in the taverns of Amsterdam and Alkmaar and Utrecht, in the informal colleges and the formal exchanges, in the ledgers and on the slates, the prices of rare tulips were climbing inexorably. A bulb worth 100 guilders one season was worth 200 the next. A bulb worth 200 was worth 500 before the winter was finished. It was not that the flowers had changed, it was that the men believed they would keep changing, keep appreciating, keep becoming more valuable. And as long as everyone believed, the fever could continue. To sit in a tavern college in Haarlem or Amsterdam in the winter of 1636 was to witness a particular kind of delirium. Not the delirium of noise or chaos, but something quieter, something that moved at the pace of chalk on slate, at the pace of conversation and wine, and the gradual increase of pressure in the room as prices climbed and climbed and climbed. The men who gathered in these rooms were not, for the most part, farmers or gardeners. They were merchants and traders and dealers and wealthy amateurs, men who had made money in other ways, in the import and export trade, in banking, in the manufacture of cloth, and who had entered the tulip market as they might enter any investment opportunity. They understood profit. They understood markets. What they did not always understand was flowers. This distinction mattered because a farmer who understands flowers knows, at some level, that a bulb is fragile, that it can rot, that it can fail to bloom, that it can be worth very little. A merchant who understands only profit can persuade himself that fragility is actually rarity, that failure to bloom is actually opportunity, that the very weaknesses of the bulb are the things that make it valuable. The colleges had developed their own culture, their own language, their own rituals of exclusion and inclusion. To be a regular at a college was to be part of something, a brotherhood, a club, a group that met regularly and whose members came to know each other, to trust each other, or at least to believe they could trust each other, to develop relationships that extended beyond the simple buying and selling of flowers. There were formal rules. Each college had written statutes. There were fines for breaking agreements, for failing to pay, for spreading false information about a bulb's lineage or quality. There were arbitrators appointed for each trading season. There were records kept, at least in some cases, in ledgers that documented the transactions and the prices. And there were informal rules as well, the rules of reputation, the rules of honor. A man who broke his word, who failed to pay for a bulb he had agreed to buy, who was caught spreading lies about the quality of a flower, such a man would find himself excluded from future transactions. His name would spread through the colleges. He would become a pariah. This was the mechanism that kept the market functioning, at least for a time. It was not formal law. The courts were uncertain whether they had authority over these transactions. The contracts were ambiguous. Many of them were not written at all, or were written in such vague terms that no one could be sure what had been agreed to. The enforcer was not a legal system, but reputation and social pressure. And so long as reputation mattered, the market held together. The transactions themselves followed certain patterns. There were the major auctions held in the summer when bulbs could be sold and handled. There were the tavern trades of the winter, conducted in the wind trade, in which bulbs that might not even exist yet offset bulbs that were still growing on mother bulbs in the ground, were bought and sold. There were the great breeders and traders, men who had accumulated large collections and who sold from them regularly. And there were the speculators, men who bought with the intention not of growing the bulbs, but of selling them again, of profiting from the rising price. By 1636, the line between these categories had become blurred. A man might buy a bulb one week, intending to grow it, then decide the following week that the rising price meant he should sell it immediately, that the profit to be made by selling now outweighed the pleasure he might take in watching it bloom. A man might participate in a Tavern College trade, purchasing a bulb at a high price, then panic and try to sell the same bulb the next evening at a loss, desperate to convert the paper promise into something tangible, something he could hold in his hand. The market had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer about flowers. It was about prices. It was about the momentum of rising numbers, about the belief that whatever had climbed yesterday would climb today, would climb tomorrow. It was about fear, fear of missing out, fear of being the man who sold too early and watched the price soar while his profits remained fixed. It was about greed, yes, but a greed that had become almost abstract. A greed not for a beautiful flower to grace a garden, but for a number in a ledger, a number that would be larger tomorrow than it was today. In the taverns, the wine flowed, the transactions multiplied. Merchants from different cities would gather, news would be exchanged. Prices from Amsterdam would be compared to prices from Alkmaar, prices from Utrecht to prices from Haarlem. The market was becoming unified, was becoming a single entity that encompassed the whole of Holland, all of the Low Countries. A price established in one city would ripple through the network, would be cited as a comparison point, would shape expectations. And Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel, the innkeeper turned dealer, the man whose orphaned children would eventually inherit the accumulated result of this fever, was somewhere in this network. He was buying, he was selling, he was participating in the colleges, the wine trades, the escalating prices. We do not know the details of his transactions. We do not know if he believed in the market or if he was simply riding it, taking profits where he could, living more comfortably than he ever had before, watching his wealth grow as the prices climbed. What we know is that he accumulated, over months and years, through transactions in taverns and formal auctions, through buying and trading and selecting, he gathered bulbs, many varieties, many of the most prized specimens of the mania. He became a man of substantial wealth, not merely an innkeeper now, but a serious dealer, a trader whose name was known in the colleges, whose reputation was established, whose acquisitions were noted. And he was dying. The winter of 1636 was the fever's height. The prices had climbed to levels that, even to the participants, seemed absurd, seemed impossible to sustain, seemed like something that would have to end. Yet day by day, week by week, the prices continued to rise. There is something that happens at the peak of a market fever, at the moment when everyone knows the price is too high, but everyone also knows that everyone else knows this and is buying anyway. It is a strange psychological state, a state of simultaneous belief and disbelief. The price is crazy, yes. The price is too high, absolutely. The price cannot be sustained, certainly. And yet, the price is rising. And if the price is rising, then the rational actor is the one who buys now, before it goes higher. In Haarlem, the colleges were running at their peak activity. The most famous college, the one that met in the Prinsenberg, was meeting multiple times per week. Dozens of transactions were taking place. The fees from the wine were increasing. The arbitrators were working late into the evenings, settling prices, documenting deals. The air in the taverns was thick with anticipation and anxiety, and a kind of electricity that comes from money being made, from wealth being created, or, though no one wanted to think about this, from illusions of wealth being sustained by a collective agreement not to look too closely. A single bulb of the rarest varieties, a Semper Augustus or a Viceroy, or one of the most prized Rembrandt tulips, might command a price of 600, 800, 1,000 guilders. These figures need context to be understood. A skilled craftsman, a carpenter or a mason, might earn 300 to 400 guilders in a year if he worked steadily. A substantial house in Amsterdam, the kind that a merchant might own, might sell for 2,000 to 3,000 guilders. So a single bulb was worth what a master craftsman earned in 2 or 3 years. A few bulbs could be worth a house. But there is a kind of price escalation that occurs in markets of this kind, where the object has no true underlying value, where the price is sustained only by belief. The price doesn't climb steadily, it accelerates. As the market fever grew hotter, as more traders entered and more people heard about the potential profits, the prices didn't just go up. They doubled. They tripled. A bulb that had sold for 50 guilders in the autumn might sell for 200 guilders by midwinter. And the strangest thing was that this made sense to the traders. It made sense because they were seeing it happen. They were participating in it. They were making money, or rather they were seeing the prices on their slates increasing, which in the fever felt like the same thing. They had bought at 100, and now it was worth 300, and someone was offering to buy at 500. How could the market go down? Who would sell at a loss when prices were rising? Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel was 60 years old in 1636. The sources do not tell us what brought on his final illness. It might have been age. It might have been one of the endemic diseases that swept through Europe in the 17th century. Plague, typhus, dysentery, any of the common killers of the time. It might have been simply that his body had worn out, that the innkeeper who had spent decades in low-ceilinged tavern rooms, breathing peat smoke and candle fumes, had finally been claimed by the wear of life. What we know is that he died, and when he died, his estate, which included his collection of bulbs, had to be settled. And because he had children who were orphaned, the authorities in his city determined that the estate would be sold at auction, the proceeds divided among them, the future of the orphans secured by the forced liquidation of their father's wealth. The auction was scheduled for early February 1637 in Alkmaar, not in Haarlem, where Wouter had lived and traded, but in Alkmaar, the neighbouring city, a prosperous town on the coast, a place where the bulb trade was also active. The auction was to be held at the Nieuwe Schuttersdoelen, a civic building, a place of some ceremony and formality. And between Wouter's death and the date of the auction, something happened to the market. The news spread through the colleges, through the taverns, through the network of dealers and traders. A significant collection was coming to auction. A dead man's bulbs would be liquidated. The collection included rarity after rarity, variety after variety, bulbs of proven lineage and established quality. It was not speculation, not a promise of a future bloom, but actual bulbs, documented and verified, ready to be sold. The traders began to prepare. Fortunes were being assembled. Men began to gather capital, to make deals with their contacts, to secure financing for the purchases they intended to make. This was the opportunity. This was the moment. The largest collection in recent memory was going to market. The price of tulips in the Tavern Colleges reached a kind of crescendo. Not every bulb rose. Some of the more common varieties, the ones that were traded in volume, had already softened slightly as traders pulled capital to prepare for the Alkmaar auction. But the rare ones, the ones that might be represented in Wouter's collection, the ones that traders believed would see increased demand once the auction occurred and wealthy purchasers from across the country converged on Alkmaar, these bulbs climbed higher. It was as if the market was preparing itself, as if everyone understood, without being told, that something significant was about to happen, that this auction would mark a kind of peak, that this would be the moment the fever reached its highest point before the inevitable descent. On February 5, 1637, the newer Scootersdoelen in Alkmaar opened its doors. The auction block was set. The bulbs from Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel's collection were arranged for display and sale. 99 lots, some singles, some collections of several bulbs of the same variety. Each lot was described carefully. Each was examined. Each was bid upon. The prices were staggering. Not the highest prices ever paid. Those had been set in tavern trades, in informal sales where the deals were struck on slates and sealed with wine. But impressive nonetheless, firm, documented, real. 99 lots, nearly 90,000 guilders. The auction took place. The bulbs were sold. The orphans were made rich, or at least richer than they had ever imagined. The collection was dispersed. Some bulbs went to dealers who immediately began planning their own sales. Some went to wealthy collectors. Some went to speculators who had gathered in Alkmaar with capital to invest in the moment of peak madness. Let us return for a moment to the winter of 1636. Not the tail end of it, not the moment of the Alkmaar auction, but earlier. November, December, the deep cold. The roads turned to slush, then ice, the canals frozen, the sunlight thin and pale, lasting only a few hours each day. This is the season of the tavern trades. This is when the colleges meet most actively. This is when the summer auctions are a distant memory and the spring planting is something that still belongs to the future. This is when windhandel flows, when the bulbs sleep in the ground, and the promises about them are written on slates and sealed with wine. In the taverns of Haarlem, in the low rooms where the candle smoke accumulated and the air grew warm despite the cold outside, the winter trade was reaching a kind of fever pitch. Prices had been climbing for months, for years really. The tulip trade had grown consistently from the early decades of the century, but the final climbing, the acceleration, had begun in 1634 and was reaching its peak in this winter of 1636. There were more traders than ever before, more amateurs entering the market, more speculation, more faith that the prices could only go up. The history of the tulip in Holland was short enough that there was no one alive who had seen a true crash, a sustained decline in prices. The tulip mania was new. The certainty that prices rose was the only certainty anyone had. A dealer in Haarlem, a man working in the colleges, would have seen a procession of transactions. A white tulip with red streaks, called an incomparable, offered at 60 guilders. 4 days later, the same variety, offered by someone else, 90 guilders. A week later, 150. A few days later, 180. The numbers climbing not because the bulb had changed, but because each seller wanted more than the last seller had gotten, because each buyer believed that the price would be higher still when it was his turn to sell. The wine flowed. The arbitrators grew rich from the transactions. The reputation of certain traders climbed as they made successful sales, as they picked the right moments to sell, as they demonstrated an ability to read the market. The reputation of others declined as they sold too early, as they found themselves holding bulbs that seemed to have reached their peak and could only decline. Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel was dying through this winter. Or perhaps not dying in the immediate sense, but aging, slowing, aware perhaps that his time in the colleges, his time as an active trader, might be growing short. He would have been accumulating his final pieces, his last acquisitions. He would have been aware that he was assembling something significant, a collection of substance and quality. And in other parts of Holland, in Amsterdam and in Utrecht, in the smaller towns and villages where the wealthy merchants lived, men were preparing for the spring. They were setting aside capital. They were making plans for which lots they would bid on at the great auctions. They were comparing prices, noting which varieties had risen most sharply, which bulbs were most sought after, which collections were rumoured to be coming to market. The winter of 1636 was a winter of anticipation. It was a winter when the market believed in itself, when prices seemed unassailable, when the idea that the tulip craze would ever end seemed impossible to contemplate. There is a quality to the peak of a fever that is very particular. It is not wild or chaotic. It is often quite orderly, quite businesslike. Prices climb steadily. Transactions are conducted with decorum. Men arrive at their regular meeting places and conduct business according to established procedures. From the outside, from the perspective of someone observing the structure of the trades, everything appears to be functioning normally. But there is a brittleness to this orderliness. There is a fragility beneath the surface. The prices have climbed so high, so fast, that there is very little margin for error. A piece of news, a shift in sentiment, a buyer or a seller who panics, any of these things could cause the structure to shudder. And once it shudders, once the certainty cracks even slightly, the cascade can begin. In the winter of 1636, the certainty had not yet cracked. The cascade had not yet begun. The market continued to function, to believe in itself, to climb higher. The Tavern Colleges continued to meet. The slates continued to be written. The wine continued to flow. The consensus held that prices could only rise, that buying was rational, that the only risk was in not buying, in being left behind by the rising tide. No one knew that this was the peak. No one understood, in those cold months, that they were at the highest point, that the descent was beginning, not in price, not yet, but in sentiment, in belief, in the conviction that sustained the entire structure. Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel was preparing to leave the market, not voluntarily, not by choice, but by the only means that was final, by ceasing to exist. His collection, accumulated through these fever winters, through the rising prices, through years of dealing and trading and participating in the colleges, was about to be liquidated, and the market, still climbing but already beginning to fracture, was about to receive the largest shock it had yet sustained. Proof positive that the rarest, most valuable bulbs could change hands, could be owned and then not owned, could have a price and then a different price, could be subject to the same mortality, the same contingency, the same risk as anything else. The Nieuwe Schuttersdoelen is a substantial building, a civic chamber where the militia of Alkmaar had met, where important events were conducted, where community business of significance was transacted. It is a building designed for ceremony, for formal proceedings, for events of weight and consequence. On February 5th, 1637, it became something more than that. It became a temple to the fever. It became the stage on which the final act of the mania would be performed. The bulbs from Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel's collection had been prepared carefully over the preceding weeks. The estate executors had arranged them by variety and quality, had organized them into lots that would appeal to different buyers, had attempted to maximize value through strategic grouping. Each lot had been described in detail, each had been examined by experts, men who knew tulips, who could assess quality, who could verify lineage and history. The reputation of the collection was established. These were not dubious bulbs, not unproven specimens, not the kinds of bulbs that might prove disappointing when they bloomed. These were known quantities, bulbs whose qualities had been verified by years of observation, whose lineages were documented, whose beauty had been confirmed by previous blooming, whose rarity was accepted and understood. The traders and dealers and wealthy collectors began arriving in Alkmaar from across Holland in the days leading up to the auction. From Amsterdam, that great maritime city where money flowed like water. From Haarlem, home of the Tavern Colleges, where the winter trade had just begun to turn uncertain. From Utrecht and Leiden and Hoorn and the smaller towns scattered throughout the Low Countries. They came by road and by canal, carrying letters of credit, carrying coin, carrying the fever in their eyes and the conviction in their hearts that this auction was the opportunity, the moment, the chance to acquire bulbs that would only increase in value. The auctioneer had prepared his ledgers. The lots had been numbered. The bulbs themselves, in their pots or in careful containers, had been arranged for display. The room had been arranged with tables where the lots could be examined, where buyers could walk from specimen to specimen, where experts could look closely at the bulbs and confirm for themselves the quality of what was being offered. The auction began. Lot by lot, bulb by bulb, Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel's collection was offered to the assembled company, and lot by lot the bidding was spirited, was intense, was driven by the conviction that these bulbs, these particular specimens from this particular collection, at this particular moment when the market had reached its peak, when the prices were climbing almost daily, were worth whatever price could be extracted from the assembled buyers. The auctioneer would present a lot. He would describe it. He would invite opening bids. The bids would come quickly, climbing steadily, each bidder attempting to outbid the last, each bidder convinced that the price would be higher when he was forced to sell, that the bulb would be worth more 3 months hence, 6 months hence, a year hence. The gavel would come down, the lot would be sold, the price would be recorded in the ledger, and the next lot would be presented. The prices that were reached at Alkmaar are now history. They are documented. They are what give the auction its legendary status, what make it the single most detailed record of the Tulip Mania that we possess. These are not rumors or estimates or reconstructions. These are actual prices, recorded at the time, in ledgers that have survived to the present day. A Semper Augustus, the most famous and most prized of all broken tulips, the one with its deep red flames on a white ground, the one that had become the symbol of the entire mania, the one that had been spoken of in reverent tones in taverns across Holland, sold for 6,000 guilders. 6,000. That is the price of a substantial Amsterdam mansion, the price of 2 or 3 large houses, the price of a year's income for an entire city block's worth of merchant families, for a bulb, for a living thing that would rest in the ground for months, that would bloom for perhaps a week or 2 in the spring, that would then fade and die, that might or might not survive to bloom again in subsequent years, that carried the virus that was slowly killing it even as it grew. But that was the rarest lot, the finest specimen. Most bulbs went for less. though still for sums that seem astonishing when viewed from the distance of centuries. The viceroys, the regal tulips with their purple and white colouring, the tulips that had been named after royalty and seemed to carry some echo of that nobility in their appearance, these might sell for a few hundred guilders. An incomparable might sell for 75 or 80 guilders. A collection of smaller bulbs, less renowned varieties, the ones that were beautiful but not supremely rare, might go for 20 or 30 guilders each. 99 lots, that was the total number. 99 separate transactions, 99 separate moments when the auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack, when a buyer's name was declared, when the price was recorded in the ledger, when the bulb changed hands from the estate of a dead man to a living buyer, a buyer with capital and hope and the fever in his eyes. The total sum, nearly 90,000 guilders. The exact figure fluctuated in the sources, but all contemporary accounts agree on the approximate total, 90,000 guilders, or very close to it. Some estimates say 87,000, some say 90,000, some even higher. But all agree that it was in this range, a sum of extraordinary magnitude. To put this figure in context, to make it comprehensible to a listener separated by nearly 400 years, you must understand that it represents an enormous sum by the standards of 1637 Holland. It is more than 100 times the annual income of a skilled craftsman, a master carpenter or mason who was at the top of his trade. It is enough to support a small town for a year. It is enough to build a substantial mansion, to outfit a trading expedition, to establish a merchant's business on a scale that would ensure stability and prosperity for a lifetime. It is wealth on a scale that most people in Holland would never see in a lifetime, let alone accumulate. It is concentrated entirely in bulbs, in flowers, in the promise that these flowers would bloom and would be beautiful, and would retain or increase their value. And the strange thing, the almost unbearably strange thing, is that at the moment of the auction, this seemed reasonable. This seemed appropriate. This seemed like a fair price for bulbs of such quality, such rarity, such beauty. The market at that moment believed in these prices. The buyers who bid these sums were not drunk or insane. They were doing what they believed to be rational, what they believed was prudent, what they believed would profit them. They were buying assets that they believed would continue to appreciate in value, that would be worth more in a month, more in 3 months, more in 6 months, more a year hence. The orphans of Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel were now, by the standards of Holland, wealthy beyond imagination. The estate that had been dispersed at Alkmaar would support them, would provide them with income, would secure their futures for life. The death of their father, tragic as it was, had been transformed by the market into a stroke of good fortune. They were orphans, yes, but they were wealthy orphans. They would never want for anything. They would never struggle. They would rise in society, would make advantageous marriages, would establish themselves as people of substance and means. The death of their father, tragic as it was, had been transformed by the market into a stroke of good fortune, or so it seemed. The collapse did not happen all at once. That is what makes it so difficult to identify the precise moment when the market turned. There was no single transaction, no single moment of rupture, but there were cracks. 2 nights after the Alkmaar auction, in Haarlem, at one of the regular college meetings, something shifted. The prices that had been climbing for months, that had reached their apex at the auction, that had seemed unassailable, these prices began to hesitate. A dealer offered to sell a bulb at a price that would have been eagerly bought just days before. The offer met silence. Another offer, more silence. Then, finally, a bid, but at a lower price. Less than what the bulb had sold for at Alkmaar. Less than what similar bulbs had commanded in the Tavern Trades. It was nothing. It was a trivial thing, a single transaction in a long evening of transactions, but it carried weight. It suggested something that had been impossible to suggest before, that the price had perhaps gone too high, that the buyer might be rational to refuse, that the climbing might have stopped. Within days, the mood had shifted entirely. It is difficult to trace exactly how this happened, how the collective belief shifted so completely and so quickly. But it did. The certainty that had sustained the market evaporated. In its place came fear. Fear of loss. Fear of holding a bulb that was no longer appreciating. Fear of being the last buyer, the one who paid the highest price, while everyone else held their bulbs and waited to sell at an even higher price. The transactions that had been routine in the taverns stopped. The slates that had been written with offers were suddenly empty. The arbitrators had no deals to settle. The wine orders declined. The colleges that had met with regularity found themselves with fewer attendees, with less energy, with a kind of haunted atmosphere. And the prices fell. Not all at once, but steadily, inexorably. A bulb that had been worth 200 guilders was offered at 150 and found no buyer. A bulb worth 150 was offered at 100. The offers continued downward, at 75, at 50, at 25. The prices were plummeting at a pace that shocked everyone, that seemed to confirm the worst fears that had begun to grip the market. A strange inversion had occurred. Where before the certainty had been that prices would only rise, the new certainty was that prices would only fall. Where before a man would pay whatever was asked, rather than miss out on future appreciation, now a man would not buy at any price, convinced that tomorrow's price would be lower. The mechanics of the market, which had sustained the climbing, now sustained the collapse. The same structure that had allowed prices to accelerate upward now allowed them to accelerate downward. The colleges continued to meet, but the transactions that took place were increasingly grim, increasingly desperate. Men who had accumulated bulbs, believing them to be safe investments, were now frantically trying to convert them back into money. The prices they demanded were ignored. The offers that were made were far lower. The gap between asking and bidding grew wider. Within weeks of the Alkmaar auction, within weeks of the moment when nearly 90,000 guilders had been paid for Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel's collection, the market had turned catastrophically. Bulbs that had sold at Alkmaar for hundreds of guilders were now offered for tens. Bulbs that had commanded thousands were offered for hundreds. The belief that had sustained the structure was gone. And the most brutal thing was this. The price had fallen so far so quickly that there was almost no liquidity at any price. No one was buying any more, not at any price. The market had not simply corrected, it had evaporated. The colleges that had been active all winter suddenly found themselves idle. The arbitrators had no disputes to settle, but only because no one was trading. The wine went unordered. The tavern rooms, which had hummed with conversation and commerce just days before, grew quiet. Men who had attended the Alkmaar auction, who had bid on bulbs with confidence, who had believed themselves to be making rational investments, found themselves holding bulbs that no one wanted at any price. The asset had transformed. It was no longer an investment vehicle. It was no longer a way to generate profit through rising prices. It was simply a bulb, a living thing in the ground, something that would bloom once and might be beautiful, and would then die, as all things die. The collapse of the market created an unprecedented legal crisis. There were contracts, there were agreements, there were debts, and they had to be settled somehow through some mechanism because the structure of commerce required it. But the problem was that the courts did not know how to handle these cases. Were the Tavern College trades binding? Were they contracts or gentlemen's agreements? What happened when a man had agreed to pay 500 guilders for a bulb, and the bulb was now worth 50 guilders? Was he obligated to pay the agreed price? Could he refuse, arguing that the circumstances had changed, that no rational person would fulfill such a contract? The cases began to arrive at the courts in February and March of 1637. At first, there were not many. But as it became clear that the market was not recovering, as it became clear that the prices were not going to climb again tomorrow or next week or next year, the cases accumulated. A buyer refusing to pay, a seller suing for payment, a debt that could not be satisfied because the collateral was gone. A man facing ruin because he had agreed to pay for bulbs that were now worth nothing. The courts struggled. The magistrates, the judges, the lawyers, none of them had authority over these matters. The tulip trade was too new, the contracts were too ambiguous, the law was unclear. Some judges refused to hear the cases at all, declaring that such matters were not properly within their jurisdiction. Some judges heard the cases, but did not know how to rule. In Amsterdam, an important meeting was held in February 1638, almost exactly a year after the Alkmaar auction, a year into the collapse. Florists and bulb dealers came together to try to establish a new basis for contracts, to try to create some kind of legal framework that might prevent future disasters. They proposed something radical, that contracts for bulbs could be settled for a fee. If a buyer could not pay or did not want to pay the full agreed price, he could settle the debt by paying a small percentage of the original sum. The proposal was for about 3.5%. This would allow people to walk away from contracts without complete ruin. It would also acknowledge that the market had collapsed, that the prices that had been agreed to were no longer valid, that some accommodation between the past and the present was necessary. But even this solution was incomplete. Many courts refused to enforce it. Many traders rejected it. Many debts were simply abandoned, left unresolved, creating a residue of bitterness and broken relationships that would persist for years. In Haarlem, in May of 1638, more than a year after the collapse, the burgomaster issued a resolution. It acknowledged the crisis. It attempted to establish some kind of legal framework for settling disputes. But by this time, much of the damage had been done. The men who had traded in bulbs, who had believed themselves to be rational investors, who had accumulated debt because they believed they were making profitable trades, these men now faced ruin. Not ruin in the sense of complete destitution. The wealthy men who had lost money could absorb the loss, but ruin in the sense of shattered expectations, ruin in the sense of debts that could not be paid, that would hang over them for years, ruin in the sense of reputation lost, of judgment questioned, of having been part of something foolish and having to live with that knowledge. Some men simply refused to pay. The courts, uncertain of their authority and reluctant to force enforcement, allowed them to refuse. Some debts were forgiven or forgotten. Some were pursued through the courts for years. Some were settled at dramatically reduced prices. Some hung over estates and families long after the original traders had died. There were suicides. There is no statistical evidence for this, no records of large numbers of men taking their own lives in despair over tulip losses. But there were reports. There were stories, some documented in contemporary accounts, of men who could not bear the loss, who could not face the ruin, who chose not to survive the collapse. Whether these stories are true, whether there were suicides, or whether this is legend added by later moralizers, we cannot now say with certainty. But the stories speak to something real, to the genuine distress that the collapse caused, to the genuine pain of watching wealth evaporate, of watching investments turn to nothing, of having to face creditors and courts, and the question, how did I allow this to happen? Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel did not live to see the collapse. He died with his reputation intact, with his collection intact, with the market still climbing. In that sense, he was fortunate. His death freed him from the consequences of the mania. His orphaned children, made wealthy by the Alkmaar auction, were also spared. At least they had the proceeds of the auction documented and received before the market collapsed. But other men were not so fortunate. Men who had traded actively in the final fever months, who had accumulated bulbs believing they were safe investments, who had borrowed money to buy more bulbs because the price was rising. These men faced consequences that ranged from merely severe to genuinely catastrophic. The truth, which Anne Goldgar's research has established, is that most of them survived. The wealthy men who lost the most money were wealthy enough to absorb the loss. No great merchant houses collapsed. The economy of Holland continued. The trade in cloth and spices and banking continued unimpeded. The Tulip Mania, for all its intensity and drama, did not wreck the economy. But it wrecked something else. It wrecked confidence. It wrecked reputation. It created a residue of bitterness and recrimination that persisted for years. And it created a permanent record, proof that the market could be mad, that prices could climb to absurdity, that rational people could be swept up in collective delusion, that the structure of commerce could be turned against itself. The legend of the Tulip Mania persisted for 2 centuries without much scrutiny. The story was taken up by moralists and economists and historians, each of whom saw in it proof of whatever they wanted to prove. It was a tale of greed. It was a tale of madness. It was a tale of the consequences of speculation. It was proof that markets were fragile, that ordinary people could be led astray, that disaster was always lurking beneath the surface of commerce. In 1841, the Scottish historian Charles Mackay published Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And in it, he recounted the Tulip Mania as perhaps the most dramatic example of collective madness ever recorded. His account became definitive. His stories, the tales of suicides, the accounts of mass bankruptcy, the notion that the entire Dutch economy had nearly been destroyed by tulips, became the standard history. And for generations, this was how the mania was remembered. As a cautionary tale, as proof of something about human nature, about greed, about the fragility of markets. Then, in 2007, a historian named Anne Goldgar published a book called Tulip Mania, Money, Honor and Knowledge in the Dutch Golden Age, and she did something that historians had not done before. She examined the original sources carefully. She read the court records. She traced the actual transactions. She attempted to determine as precisely as possible what had actually happened. And what she found was more interesting than the legend because it was more complex. The mania had been real. The prices had climbed dramatically. The market had indeed collapsed. But the economic damage had been far more limited than the legend suggested. The wealthy merchants who lost the most money could absorb the loss. The economy of Holland continued to thrive. There were no mass bankruptcies. There were no waves of suicides. There was no economic catastrophe. What there was, instead, was something more subtle and in some ways more revealing. A social crisis, a crisis of reputation, a crisis of honor. When a man in 1637 agreed to pay 500 guilders for a bulb, and the price collapsed to 50 guilders, he faced a choice. He could pay the agreed price, at a loss of 450 guilders, an enormous sum, or he could refuse to pay. If he paid, he would fulfill his obligation and preserve his honor, but he would face financial harm. If he refused, he would preserve his wealth but damage his reputation. If word spread that he had broken his agreement, if he became known as a man who did not honor his commitments, then he would find himself excluded from future transactions, distrusted by his peers, marked as someone who could not be relied upon. This was the crisis that the Tulip Mania created. Not an economic crisis, a crisis of meaning, a crisis of how honor and obligation should be balanced against self-interest and material survival. And this is why the mania matters. Not because it destroyed an economy, it did not, but because it revealed something about how markets work, about how price is determined not by the inherent value of a thing, but by the collective belief in its value, and about how fragile that belief can be. The tulips themselves are still blooming. In gardens across Holland and across the world, tulips continue to grow and to flower, to produce their unexpected patterns and colors. The tulip-breaking virus still does its work, still produces broken flowers, still creates beauty at the edge of death. Many of the varieties that were traded during the mania are gone now. The Semper Augustus disappeared. Other famous broken tulips are extinct, lost when the bulbs finally succumbed to the virus, when there was no one left who cared enough to keep breeding them, to maintain the lineage. Modern broken tulips are different. They are not the same varieties that were traded during the mania. They are not infected with the same virus. They are the product of modern breeding, of deliberate hybridization, of humans attempting to recreate the effect of breaking through science rather than through accident and disease. They are beautiful, but they are not mysterious. The virus that made them is no longer present, no longer giving them that quality of fragility, that knowledge that they are dying even as they bloom. Modern broken tulips are simply flowers that have been bred to look like broken flowers. They are the simulacrum of the original. They lack the intimacy with death that made the original broken tulips so precious. The orphans of Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel became wealthy from the Alkmaar auction. The records do not tell us much about what they did with their wealth, how they lived, whether they were happy. They lived through the collapse. They held bulbs that had been valuable and became worthless. But the proceeds of the auction were real. They had that wealth. What happened to them after that is lost to history. The Tavern Colleges continued to meet, but the tulip trade never regained the fever heat of the late 1630s. The bulbs remained valuable. Beautiful things are always valuable to those who love them, but the madness passed. The fever broke. The market rationalized itself, established rules, created distance between the prices people were willing to pay and the faith they placed in rising prices. And the legend persisted, shaped and reshaped by generations of moralizers. We live with the consequences of that legend. We live in a world where tulips are associated with madness, where the Tulip Mania is the classic example of irrational market behavior, where the very word mania carries the weight of the 17th century fever. But if you look more carefully, if you look at the sources rather than the legend, if you understand the market as a social structure as much as an economic one, then the mania becomes something different. It becomes a story about how prices are created through collective agreement, about how the agreement can hold together for a long time and then suddenly break, about how honor and obligation and self-interest can be in terrible conflict when the prices no longer support themselves. It is a story about a man named Wouter Bartholomeusz Winkel, an innkeeper and dealer who accumulated bulbs through years of trading in the Tavern Colleges of Haarlem. He died before the collapse. His collection was auctioned and dispersed. His orphaned children were made wealthy by the fever that consumed the market, just as the fever reached its peak. It is a story about broken flowers, about beauty existing at the edge of death, about humans willing to pay enormous prices not for the thing itself, but for the rarity, for the uniqueness, for the knowledge that the thing will not last forever. It is a story about markets, about how rational people can participate in collective madness, about how belief and price and value and fear can all move together in ways that seem sensible in the moment and absurd when observed from the outside. It is a story that repeats, not with tulips anymore, but with other things, with equities and currencies and cryptocurrencies and art and real estate, with anything that has a price but no fixed value, with anything whose worth is determined by what someone is willing to pay rather than by any inherent property of the thing itself. And so the ledger remains open, the story remains unresolved. The fever may have broken in 1637, but the pattern it revealed, the pattern of how markets work, of how belief creates price, of how that price can climb and then collapse. This pattern remains as true now as it ever was. The Tulip Mania is not a historical curiosity. It is a permanent feature of how human markets work, and perhaps, that is what remains. In a garden in the spring, tulips bloom. Some are solid colors, bred for their straightforward beauty. Some have been bred to resemble broken tulips, to carry the memory of breaking even though the virus is no longer present. They bloom for a week or two. They fade. They disappear until the next spring. They are beautiful. No one pays thousands of guilders for a single bulb anymore. The fever has long since broken. But the flowers remain. And in their fragility, in their brief appearance and disappearance, they carry something of the meaning they had in 1637. They carry the knowledge that beauty is often linked with brevity, that the most precious things are often the ones that will not last, that the price of a thing is not always connected to its value, that meaning can be created through collective agreement and can evaporate just as quickly. The candle is burning low now. The ledger is being closed. The season is turning. The bulbs are going into the ground, and they will sleep there through the darkness until the spring comes again. And that is what remains. Sleep well.